I'm starting by showing my personal favorites of 2025. I do sometimes look into what's popular, which is why one of my personal favorites is Golden from K-pop Demon Hunters. And then there's the stuff that, depending on what community you're in, may be very well known or unknown. For example, I like those who use motion tracking to operate virtual avatars for presentation and performance, as well as those who do animations for those people, which of course why I find interest in Galgura, Iron Mouse, and Calliope Mori. So with all that said, hello and welcome to my virtual presentation. I am your host Austin, and this is going to be a response to Casey Simpson, Jade the Artist, and Blue Haven Boulevard. And they all have interesting points that relate to pop music. I do want to go in depth talking about pop culture, but I'm learning that there's a lot I just don't understand, so that I'm putting on hold. But yeah, when it comes to the whole thing with pop music, there are some curiosities that they all talk about. Casey talks a bit about this, about how too many people will favor the modern over the retro, rather they want to call it classic, old school, or whichever. And this would make sense if not for what Jade and Blue Haven talk of, which is how a lot of people will favor the old over the modern. But I do see why this contradiction exists, because you got a lot, because it's all a matter of popularity. And this does go back into what Casey said about how he was mocked for liking Billy Joel, but no modern popular artists. And this does remind me of what happened with the New York Times. They did a list talking about what they considered the best living music artists, and Billy Joel's off the list. They come up with excuses, and many people, including Rick Beato, have done a couple videos talking about this, about the New York Times basically dismissing people like Billy Joel. So yeah, it's less of a modern versus retro, whichever, and more like what is popular, what is trending today. Seeing how even the old stuff will not be considered good unless there's a modern audience unless it's trending to the modern audience. So a lot of this is about the trend and what is popular. And pop music tends to be a bit weird like that. Another thing that Casey talks about with his experience is how he liked, because he is an actor, to better get into a role, he'll listen to a song that gets him into the right mood, the right headset, the right mindset, I should be saying. And a lot of this is reminding me of what Ted Joy mentioned when he talks about the secret shame of music. See, music criticism goes all the way back millennia, all the way back to philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. And they would talk about how there is good music and bad music. And unfortunately, bad music would often be something that's emotional and expressive. And enjoying such, these philosophers would equate to public drunkenness. So yeah, music can change your mood and change your outlook and stuff like that. But there are a lot of people who were dismissive back then, and unfortunately we do live in an era where that is repeated, where if it's too emotional or too expressive, it's not considered a good song. That is unfortunately a reality we do live in today. History repeating itself. Of course, though, there are points that Jade gets into with her video. How 2020 there was that isolation, and this makes sense. The most interesting thing about the isolation is how people were split. Because many did retreat to the internet, going into online social groups, some of which talking about video games, some talking about animations, some talking about mystery books. And then, of course, you have the virtual reality stuff, VR chat and Second Life, stuff like that, which, of course, had a huge growth when it comes to those who are virtual performers. known as VTubers. So that is a thing that happened. However, when it comes to this isolation, there is another thing to point out, because there were those who went with the online, and then there's those who basically stuck with television. And around that time, one of the big things, unfortunately, is what's called reality TV. And this is where we're going to get into Tantacruel. He talks about how music in reality TV is insanely manipulative. And he does make some excellent points. A lot of the music is very simple, it's very basic, telling you what to think of what goes on in the scene rather than having you come to your own conclusion. However, Venus Theory also points out another thing which may be contributing to the shortening of attention spans, which is how in one moment it's sad, you have the sad music playing, or as he calls it, auto sad, because it's supposed to make you feel sad. And then seconds later, you have fanfare and people being all happy and jolly and everything's good, celebration. And it's like, so you have a shift once going from a few seconds, and then a few seconds later, something else happens, and then a few seconds later, something else. And I think a lot of people were, because they were exposed to this constantly, they were probably conditioned to expect something to change every few seconds. And unfortunately, we also see this in children's entertainment, something that Casey points out in a few of his videos as well, and many, many others. This constant exposure to this constant change every few seconds probably just affected how people view reality, their expectation. Why they can't enjoy long form entertainment. As well as why a lot of music made today, it's for that crowd. A lot of the pop music is made for that crowd, stuff that blends into the background and whatnot. It's very basic sounds, whatever sticks to being familiar. Of course, so there is one other thing Jay talks about, which is going to have me referencing one more person, which is in relation to algorithms. Because a lot of people, they don't bother with the TV, but they don't bother with the online, but they do bother with music stations, radio stations, broadcasts, but many also retreat to online services such as Spotify and iTunes. And this is where we get into another problem, as pointed out by Venus Theory, what he refers to as the playlistification of music. This is an extremely condensed version of one of the points a few of the points that he makes in his video, which is that you have these curators, and so they make money going through based on what music that they can rate as good or bad. But because they want to make more bang for the buck, and some don't even get paid until they reach a certain threshold of music reviews, oftentimes the shorter music gets more attention than the longer music. And because the algorithm sees this ends up being pushed out more and more. Likewise, a lot of artists to get noticed will push out a lot of shorter music to get more attention. And while there are those who certainly do come up with some interesting short songs, such as Small Pools with the song Run with the Bulls, there are others who just decide to take the same 40 seconds and just repeat it over and over. As Jade said, it's chorus after chorus with no more than a few lines as a verse, if a verse even exists. So that is something that unfortunately happens. And of course, with people relying on the algorithms, they look towards one thing, and then next thing you know, the algorithm ends up recommending stuff based on that one search, while completely dismissing everything else that user may enjoy. And so between the algorithm and the curators, we end up with a lot of stuff being pushed towards a large group of people that they may not even enjoy. Which also gets into why a lot of music may seem boring now. And why stuff that should be considered a hit song, it just doesn't hit like it used to. It's a combination of all this. Of course, so there is one other thing to talk about. Because while Blue Haven does talk about a lot of these points and make some excellent points. There are also something unique that he brings up, which is the whole thing about the charts. And the charts, they only look at very specific information. They're not looking towards what certain communities like and whatnot. They just look towards what's big on Spotify, what's big on TikTok, and that's it. Every other community that has formed online, they're irrelevant. And this is why I'm using this scene in OBS rather than my usual, because I've done this for earlier this year for another video. Some stats I found that I think is going to be mind-blowing. Spotify, earlier this year, 761 million users with 293 million subscribers in 184 markets. Not gonna lie, that is a lot. And then you got the TikTok numbers. TikTok, earlier in as of March 24, 2026, which has about 1.99 billion active users globally, and the world's 5th most used social media. That is a fascinating thing. But what about people like me who don't use TikTok, who don't use Spotify? Well, we are among the majority when it comes to the global population of almost 8.3 billion people. Yep. And as it says down there, the exact number, 8,289,834,989 recorded and documented people. So a lot of what's shaping pop culture and pop music, I should be saying, is what is enjoyed by a quarter of the world. Granted, there are discrepancies here and there, but still, the fact that about 6.3 billion people do not use Spotify or TikTok, but that is what's going to dictate what the charts look at. What was that number again? What that 1.99 billion look at, what they listen to, what is popular with that community, rather than what is enjoyed by the entirety of the world as a whole. Of course, though, numbers like these do tend to get difficult to track because, like I said, you have other communities. You have the anime community, which doesn't always use TikTok or Spotify. You have the gaming community that don't always use TikTok or Spotify. And of course, though, the virtual community. And there is that overlap. Sure, some do go to TikTok, some do have their music on Spotify. But then there's also many who don't. And it's this comparatively small number that basically dictates what's on the charts. So if you're wondering, why is it that I feel alien among my peers? Why is it that the music is boring? Why does the hit songs on the charts just don't hit for you? Maybe it's because it's stuff related to a community that you don't find relatable. Maybe look into what the other communities are. It is just anime and gaming and the virtual, and there's also many others who have their own interests, their own little memes, their own music. And maybe that's where you'll find what's exciting and what's engaging, what's emotional. But that's what I have to say when it comes to this video and what my thoughts are, as well as why I think that way. So with that said, I am Austin, and I thank you for watching.